Hi everyone, I'm Andy, and this is the AI Breakdown. Welcome to your weekly news edition, where I'll cover what happened in AI last week and why it matters. Before we start, quick message from our sponsor, and then we'll get into it. This episode is sponsored by Notify Technology, a health and safety software partner, helping teams run incident management, audits and inspections, and risk assessments in one place. And with Notify Spark, their AI companion, they're streamlining incident reporting and investigations, saving time, reducing admin load, and helping teams act faster on what matters. Learn more at notifytechnology.com. Let's start with a story that, I think, sits underneath several of the others this week. OpenAI making a very deliberate play for the enterprise without building a traditional enterprise services army. On the 23rd, OpenAI announced what it's calling Frontier Alliances, multi-year partnerships with McKinsey, BCG, Accenture, and Capgemini. The idea is pretty straightforward. Those firms will sell, implement, and scale OpenAI's Frontier AI agent platform inside big organizations. Frontier is described as a no-code system that acts as a semantic layer for the enterprise, so AI agents can move across the tools you already run. CRM, ERP, HR systems, internal ticketing, the messy reality of the corporate stack. And OpenAI is being unusually explicit about the division of labor. McKinsey and BCG do the boardroom side, strategy, operating model redesign, change management. Accenture and Capgemini do the heavy lifting, systems integration, data architecture, lifecycle support. Each of them is building a dedicated practice group certified on OpenAI tech. And OpenAI is sending forward-deployed engineers to embed alongside the consulting teams at client sites. A couple of numbers worth holding on to. Enterprise is already about 40% of OpenAI's revenue, and they're targeting 50% by year-end. And this whole push is being driven by Denise Dresser, former Slack CEO, who OpenAI hired as Chief Revenue Officer in December. Why does this matter if you're buying or building in enterprise tech? Because consulting firms are where software decisions start, especially in those digital transformation conversations that happen way before there's any neat RFP or procurement process. Not in procurement, not in the App Store, not even with the IT team half the time. It's in that awkward phase where someone says, we need to modernize X, and a consultant turns that into a program, a timeline, and, crucially, a short list of vendors. Fortune summed up the mood by saying this is likely to add another layer of anxiety for enterprise software investors. And you can see why. If McKinsey and BCG are actively evangelizing an agent platform as an alternative interface layer over your existing stack, that's not a normal competitor. That's a competitor turning up inside your customer's transformation plan. There's also a very practical point OpenAI made in its own statement. The limiting factor for seeing value from AI in enterprises isn't model intelligence. It's how agents are built and run in their organizations. That's basically them saying, look, the models are good enough. What's missing is implementation. And it's not just OpenAI saying that. Julie Sweet, Accenture's CEO, framed it as end-to-end execution across technology and data, but also security and change management. Basically, the bits that tend to kill these projects in the real world. Capgemini's Fernando Alvarez was even blunter. It's not an easy task. If it was a walk in the park, OpenAI would have done it by themselves, so it's recognition that it takes a village. My personal take, this is OpenAI borrowing a page from the 1990s SAP expansion, where the big consultancies built enormous businesses implementing ERP. The difference is speed. ERP took a decade to roll through industries. If agent platforms become the new interface layer for enterprise workflows, that cycle could compress from a decade into a few years. And for buyers, I think the key question isn't, is Frontier better than Salesforce, or whatever? It's more like, do you want to buy an agent layer that sits across multiple systems and then gradually replatform underneath it? Because that's a very different migration story from rip and replace. The sentiment this week was this odd mix of strategic praise and investor nerves. TechCrunch noted enterprise adoption has been relatively slow, and this move is aimed right at the root cause. Most organizations simply don't have the in-house expertise, to deploy and run AI agents at scale. Skeptics are right that enterprise procurement is slow and risk-averse, but the bullish argument is also real. If the consultants are the ones doing the work, you can bypass a lot of the old sales cycle. Now, there's a completely different kind of enterprise power on show in the next story, government power. Because over in Washington, the Pentagon basically picked a fight with Anthropic. On the 23rd, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth summoned Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei for what officials described as an ultimatum ahead of a Tuesday sit-down at the Pentagon. One senior defense official, quoted via Axios, said, "This is not a get-to-know-you meeting. This is not a friendly meeting. This is a shit-or-get-off-the-pot meeting," which is not subtle. The core dispute is about military use. The Pentagon wants AI labs to allow their models for all lawful purposes in military settings, including classified operations. Anthropic says it has two red lines: no mass surveillance of Americans and no weapons that fire without human involvement. This escalated after Claude was reportedly used during a January 3 special operations raid to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, deployed via Anthropic's partnership with Palantir on classified networks. NBC News also reports a Palantir executive was reportedly alarmed after an Anthropic employee appeared to question how Claude was used in that operation. And the Pentagon's threat here is extreme. They've said they could designate Anthropic as supply chain risk, a label normally reserved for foreign adversaries like Huawei. If that happened, it would void Anthropic's $200 million contract and force every company doing business with the Pentagon to certify they're not using Claude. The reporting notes that 8 of the 10 largest US companies already use Claude, and Claude is currently the only frontier model deployed on Department of Defense classified networks. Why does this matter for a business audience? 2 reasons. First, this is going to set a template. AI companies are going to have to decide what boundaries they can maintain when a government customer says, "We'll buy it, but on our terms." Anthropic's spokesperson said they're having productive conversations in good faith with the Department of Defense on how to continue the work and get these complex issues right. Second, it creates procurement uncertainty that spills into the private sector. The reporting frames the supply chain risk move as basically a nuclear option, and that's why this isn't just a Washington food fight. If you're picking an AI vendor and your company has any defense-adjacent contracts, you now have to think about the possibility, however remote, that a model becomes politically toxic. My personal take is that Anthropic's stance might actually become a selling point. The public reaction was overwhelmingly pro-Anthropic, and eWeek made a sharp point. If any other model were as good, the Pentagon would just switch. The fact they're threatening punishment instead of walking away is maybe the strongest endorsement Claude has ever received. Sticking with Anthropic for a moment, because they had a huge week on the commercial side as well. Bloomberg published a profile saying Claude Code has reached $2.5 billion in annualized run rate revenue. It's doubled since the start of 2026 and apparently hit $1 billion ARR within 6 months of its public release. Enterprise subscriptions quadrupled in the same period, and enterprise customers are now more than half of Claude Code revenue. And Bloomberg reported that 4% of all public code commits on GitHub globally now come from Claude Code, double the prior month. And they just launched Claude Code Security. This uses the Opus 4.6 model to scan code bases for vulnerabilities, tracing data flows, and understanding business logic, so it's aiming to catch flaws that rule-based scanners miss. The team said they found over 500 vulnerabilities across open-source code bases that had persisted through multiple rounds of expert review, which is a pretty sobering signal about how much slips through even good processes. And importantly, all patches still require human approval. The market reaction was dramatic. CrowdStrike fell 8%, Cloudflare 8.1%, Okta 9.2%, Scala 5.5%, and the Global X Cybersecurity ETF dropped 4.9% to its lowest since November 2023. Over $15 billion in cyber market value evaporated in a single session. Why does this matter for leaders? 2 angles. One is simply that AI-assisted coding is no longer a side tool. If you've got a product doing $2.5 billion run rate, with enterprise as the majority and 4% of global GitHub commits. You're looking at behavior change at scale. The second is the creep from we help you write code to we help you secure code to eventually we replace a chunk of your AppSec pipeline. And that's a huge market. Now, the nuance, analysts pointed out that the public companies that got hit in the sell-off aren't necessarily the ones most directly threatened. The application security firms you'd normally think of, Checkmarx, Veracode, Snyk, those are private. So the public cyber names might just have absorbed the volatility as proxies. My take on this is, the market move feels like a cartoon version of what's happening, but the underlying shift is real. Coding and security are getting their biggest facelift since the advent of the cloud. All of that feeds into the story that dominated the finance conversation, the SaaSpocalypse. The numbers here are bonkers. A rolling sell-off has erased nearly $1 trillion in market value from the S&P 500 Software and Services Index in the first 6 weeks of 2026. It started mid-January when Anthropic launched Claude Code, a desktop-native AI agent, and then accelerated through February as OpenAI rolled out its frontier alliances with McKinsey, BCG, Accenture, and Capgemini to get its frontier agent platform deployed inside big enterprises. As of late February, the declines were brutal. HubSpot down 39.2%, DocuSign down 31.7%, ServiceNow down 27.5%, Salesforce down 24.7%, and Palantir down 25% even though it's posting 70% revenue growth. Atlassian was down 35% in a single week. Valuations compressed hard. Forward earnings multiples for the sector collapsed from an average of 39 times to 21 times. The sector RSI hit 18, most oversold since 1990. Hedge funds shorted about $24 billion in software stocks. Here's the weird bit. CNBC and Yahoo Finance both pointed out the software group was still putting up roughly 17% aggregate earnings growth, even as multiples fell back to around November 2022 levels. One analyst in that coverage basically called it a pricing error. This is the first time the market has tried to price AI disruption risk into incumbent enterprise software in a serious way. Bank of America's Vivek Arya framed the paradox nicely. Investors can't punish hyperscalers for low near-term returns on AI spend and at the same time assume AI will obliterate all software. And the disruption story isn't totally imaginary. There are structural triggers in the reporting. Klarna ditched Salesforce and Workday and consolidated onto its own AI-augmented stack. Procurement teams started talking about right-sizing software. Databricks CEO Ali Ghodsi had the cleanest articulation. Moats collapse when the interface becomes natural language. And he also said, if the value of Salesforce or ServiceNow lived in their UI rather than their data, and the UI can now be replicated by a general-purpose model, then the moat was shallower than anyone thought. But there's also a strong contrarian case. Replacing embedded enterprise systems is slow and then you have to maintain it. You're dealing with years of migration, compliance recertification, workflow redesign. And Jensen Huang from NVIDIA called the whole thing the most illogical thing in the world, basically pushing back on the idea that software is in decline and will be replaced by AI. And speaking of operational reality, Spotify gave us one of the most specific, concrete examples yet of what AI-first development can look like inside a big, real company. On their Q4 2025 earnings call in February, Spotify co-CEO Gustav Söderström said that their most senior engineers haven't written a single line of code since December. His words were, they actually only generate code and supervise it. The system they're using is internal, called Honk, and it's built on Anthropic's Claude Code, specifically leveraging the December release of Claude Opus 4.5. The workflow he described is almost comically modern. On their commute, an engineer can message Claude in Slack to fix a bug or add an iOS feature. Claude generates the code and pushes a new app version back in Slack. The engineer can merge to production before they even get to the office. Now, Spotify did ship 50+ new features throughout 2025, things like AI-powered prompted playlists, page match for audiobooks, and About This Song. And they also posted strong Q4 numbers. 290 million premium subscribers, up 10% year on year, 751 million monthly active users, up 11%, revenue of 4.5 billion euros, up 13%, and operating income of 701 million euros. Söderström called Christmas 2025 a singular event in terms of AI productivity, the point where things just started working, and he added, there is going to have to be a lot of change in these tech companies if you want to stay competitive. It will be painful for many companies. Why does this matter if you're not Spotify? Because it's the clearest executive admission I've seen that AI tools have fundamentally changed how software gets built at scale. Not vague, we're more productive, but here's the model, here's the tool, here's how people work now. But the sentiment from developers was skeptical. This went viral on Reddit, and the concerns were consistent. One was the supervision problem. Reading and verifying AI code might be harder than writing it. The second was selection bias. Senior engineers can spot nonsense instantly, juniors can't. And the third was skill atrophy. People worrying that if you stop writing code, you lose the feel for it. My take is, Spotify's example is real, but it's also not magically replicable. The reporting points out Spotify already had organizational infrastructure that makes this manageable, Backstage, which it's been using since 2020 to track code ownership, and a fleet management framework to coordinate changes across hundreds of repos. That's the boring stuff, but it's exactly the stuff you need if you're going to let AI generate code at speed without turning your code base into a haunted house. Alright, quick fire round to close out, with a handful of stories that are smaller individually, but together paint a pretty clear picture of where the industry is heading. First, India hosted the AI Impact Summit 2026 in New Delhi, and the scale was enormous. Over 250,000 visitors, 3,250 speakers, 300 exhibitors, 20 plus heads of state. On investment pledges, Reliance/Jio said $110 billion over 7 years for AI data centers and edge computing. Adani committed $100 billion by 2035 for renewable-powered AI infrastructure. Microsoft confirmed a $50 billion global South AI investment by 2030, with $17.5 billion already committed to India. Google announced a $15 billion AI hub in Visakhapatnam, and India's IT Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw said total commitments could reach more than $400 billion across the AI stack over the next 2 years. The summit also ended with a New Delhi declaration on AI impact signed by 88 countries, non-binding, but it tells you how hard India is pushing to be the convening point here. Mukesh Ambani framed it neatly. India cannot afford to rent intelligence. We will reduce the cost of intelligence as dramatically as we did the cost of data. Second, AI is now showing up in performance reviews. Accenture told associate directors and senior managers that promotion to leadership requires regular adoption of AI tools, and for some, they're collecting weekly login data for AI refinery, though staff in 12 European countries and people on US federal contracts are exempt. KPMG said that from the 2026 review cycle, everyone will be graded on meeting AI adoption objectives, and they're tracking engagement through Microsoft Copilot usage data. Meta made AI-driven impact a core expectation for all employees, with bonuses for exceptional AI-driven impact. Third, Perplexity announced it's completely phased out advertising. The numbers were almost funny, about $20,000 in ad revenue in 2024 out of $34 million total, so they're doubling down on subscriptions and enterprise. Their exec said a user needs to believe it's the best possible answer, and ads make users start doubting everything. This lands right in the middle of the wider split between ad-supported AI and ad-free AI, especially now that OpenAI has reportedly started testing ads in ChatGPT for some lower tiers. And finally, OpenAI is reportedly finalizing a funding round expected to exceed $100 billion at a valuation that could surpass $850 billion. OpenAI told investors 2025 revenue was $13.1 billion, with a 2026 forecast of $30 billion and a 2030 target of $280 billion. They revised their compute spend target to about $600 billion by 2030, down from the $1.4 trillion number that had been floating around. So even they are putting a line under what's financially realistic. ChatGPT is now at 900 plus million weekly active users, but they are also projecting cash burn of $25 billion in 2026 and $57 billion in 2027, with positive cash flow not expected until 2030. Sam Altman said, "We are growing at an extremely fast rate right now. As long as we can have reasonable unit economics, we should focus on continuing to grow faster and faster." If you zoom out, the through line is pretty consistent. Models are getting cheaper and more widely distributed. Whole countries are trying to become compute hubs. Companies are mandating AI usage, and the biggest players are raising sums of money that don't really have historical precedent. That's all for this week's AI Roundup. If you found value in this breakdown, please leave a rating and hit subscribe. See you next week.